In the spring of 1951, a Chinese buildup was in progress in the Iron Triangle, a mountainous region north of the 38th parallel. UN forces sought to conquer the triangle since it would provide a comfortable buffer zone between the enemy and Seoul. But its borders were heavily guarded and tough to crack. Far East Commander Ridgway knew the Chinese were planning a major drive from the triangle, so he assumed a conservative offensive strategy in the approaches to it. After facing the Chinese for 6 months, his troops knew how they operated. They would come hard, and then suddenly not at all. They were vicious fighters, but only in spurts. So Ridgway drew a series of lines leading up to the Iron Triangle that would mark the stages of his planned advance. When the troops reached one line, they would use it as a jumping-off point to push on for the next. If they had to fall back, the previous line would be a place to stop and shore up defenses so that the retreat wouldn't pick up speed. Each line was named for an American state. The 8th Army had recently conquered the Idaho Line and was now standing along the Kansas Line a few miles above the 38th parallel. The next goal would be the Utah Line, an extension of the Kansas. Finally, the Wyoming Line lay at the base of the Iron Triangle. Whether going or coming along that grid, the UN goal was to butcher the enemy in massive numbers. By late April, UN forces were holding the Utah Line and pushing hard to reach Wyoming. Then the second Chinese wave suddenly broke. On April 22nd, heavy attacks came against the weaker South Korean units in the center of the peninsula. The Reds again threatened to split the UN front in two, but the new phase line retreat strategy worked. The 8th Army fell back to the Kansas line and dug in deep. There they held hard and took everything the Chinese could offer. Within a week, the enemy ran low on supplies and men and suffered huge losses for an insignificant piece of land. To the American troops who had seen their adversaries run out of gas after all of their previous attacks, this was no surprise. The communists were getting predictable. 2 weeks later, the Chinese tried one last major offensive, but this time, Field Commander Van Fleet had a special treat for them. He ordered an unprecedented barrage of heavy artillery. In a single 24-hour period, one battalion fired off more than 12,000 rounds, an all-time record. Teams of troops operated an assembly line of ammunition, sending an endless succession of shells airborne. 35,000 Chinese were killed or wounded, at a cost of only 900 UN servicemen. The bombardment is remembered today as the Van Fleet Load. The general's aim to expend steel, not men, had come to fruition. UN firepower was beating Red manpower. In June, Van Fleet's forces made it to the Wyoming line. Their advance was moving so fast that they overran active communist bases and took thousands of prisoners and supplies as they went. But when they tried to break into the Iron Triangle itself, they collided with a steel wall of enemy resistance. It took 10 days of round-the-clock air support and artillery attacks to break into the triangle's base. But once they cracked the foundation, the whole house collapsed. 2 tank forces drove northward and took full control of the triangle, putting the UN in their best position since the Chinese entered the war. It was an ideal field position to bring to the truce table. total victory over the Chinese might take years and cost countless American lives. So Ridgway wired Washington to say the time to talk peace was now. President Truman and his Joint Chiefs concurred. It was time to extend the olive branch.